All right, so we're getting everyone into the discussion. First of all, we just want to say, I'll say, my name is Audrey Williams. I'm with the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race at George Mason University. And I just want to say welcome to all of you as you are coming into this event. We have a really great lineup of discussion for tonight. And also we just really want to welcome you all. Send out, messages of, support and peace and justice during this time, especially during the pandemic as well. And the one interesting spot, I guess, is that we get to reach out to beyond just our immediate area. So I just want to go over a few notes about how this will be going. In a few moments, I'll turn it over to Andy Shalal, the founder and CEO of Busboys and Poets, to explain a little bit more about this event series, introduce our speaker, introduce as well our co-moderator, Dr. Charles Chavis. But in the meantime, I want to let you all know that because we have so many participants, the way we'll be kind of creating a discussion for you is first you'll see that we have an opening slide that has a question for you all to consider. And please, as I see the chat going, please get answering that question in the chat. We'll also be gathering questions from the chat and as well as from our live stream on the Busboys and Poets Facebook page. So with so many people, we've got, close to 300 people joining in right now. We won't be able to get to all of the questions, but we're going to try as hard as we can to get a really interesting discussion here. And we'll be following up with you after this event just to thank you for your participation and offer you other ways to get involved. And I just want to note that, this is an ongoing series. And if you want to be able to learn more about how you can enjoy and join the other events, you can follow the social media of all of the organizations that have organized this, which is Busboys and Poets, the John Mitchell Program, and the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. We'll also follow up after this event with more information about how you can follow us on social media and subscribe to our mailing lists. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Andy Shalal.
Well, thank you so much, Audrey, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us in this conversation. We are about to go into a curfew here in Washington, D.C. in just a few, in about an hour. So everybody's home here in D.C., or soon will be home. Makes it easier to join. I'd like to welcome you to the first in a series of these race dialogues. This is a joint effort with the George Mason University, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race, the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project led by Will Schwartz. I want to say a very special thank you to Dr. Charles Chavis, who first approached me with having this idea. He'll be co-hosting this event with us here at Busboys and Poets. This is a series that takes off where our own in-house series at Busboys and Poets left off right before the coronavirus pandemic. The series was called Actor, a continuing talk on race, and it's been going on, we'd like to think of it as the longest running race dialogue in the Washington metropolitan area. It's been going on for 15 years. It provides a venue for intimate and oftentimes difficult conversations around race. Of course, it seems like most conversations around race are difficult. We try to make them not only accessible, but also easier to go about. We facilitate these conversations, and we've been very successful. Every event we've had on a monthly basis has been, standing room only, and it's remarkable. So I want to turn it over for a few moments to Dr. Chavis to give us a little bit of an intro as well, and then we'll move to introduce our speaker, who I'm very thrilled to have on the show.
Well, first and foremost, I want to start off by saying thank you, Andy, for your work and for partnering with us on this, as well as Will Schwartz of the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project and my staff. I just wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the John Mitchell Jr. Program. So the John Mitchell Jr. Program is named after an anti-lynching advocate, Virginia native, who worked alongside Ida B. Wells to speak out against racial terror lynchings throughout the South and throughout the nation. And I really feel like our program was established just for a time such as this, where we still continue to see these modern day lynchings take place in the U.S. and not just in the South, but all across the nation, as they have done throughout the history of this country. And I think for me, something that I really want us to understand and take from this moment is that we grasp the reality of the United States, America's original pandemic, which I believe is racism, right? And that's something that we need to come to grasp with. Well before COVID-19, racism was alive and well, and the Black and brown communities that are suffering, whose struggles have been lifted to the front of the news pages throughout the world. These are struggles that are present in Black and brown communities every single day, not just whenever cameras are there recording. And my prayer is that as we move forward, white allies and others who want to participate and support the Black freedom struggle will do so and continue to do so once the dust settles and the cameras are not here. And so with that, I'll transfer and take it back over to Andy to introduce Mr. Tim Wise.
Thank you, Charles. To launch this first collaboration between the Carter School and Busboys and Poets of this continuing series, we thought we would begin with one of the most respected voices on the topic of race and race relations. Tim Wise is an author and public intellectual, dissecting race and race relations in America and making them easier to understand and comprehend, especially coming from a white guy. As a white guy, he brings an anti-racist lens to the conversation and carves out a path for a way forward. He has been featured at the African American Museum of History and Culture. He received in 2010 25 Visionaries Who Are Changing Your World from Utne magazine. We are thrilled that he could join us tonight for our launch of this new series. I'd like to welcome Tim to this first of Actor. Thank you. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you. Well, if you like, I'd like to begin with the first question and then turn it back to Dr. Chavis. Dr. Chavis referred to America's first pandemic wasn't smallpox, or it wasn't the flu, or it wasn't polio. It was racism, and we now are facing a pandemic, the coronavirus, and there's an effort to find a vaccine for this virus, and everybody's working on it to fix it. And there's good reason to believe that a vaccine will be at hand probably sometime early part of next year. Now, that's a very short time, right? We've been in this for over 400 years now with racism. Any effort to try to find a vaccine for this?
Well, I think we could say that there have certainly been people who have looked for one, literally or figuratively speaking, for that entire 400 years. But I think the fact that we haven't found one, and the fact that we haven't gotten herd immunity, which tells you, right? I mean, we would have herd immunity if this were something we could get, because everyone's been exposed, and yet we continue to see the way that racism and white supremacy play out all throughout that period. What that tells me is that what we have here is less a virus and more a socially transmitted disease that is not so much viral as it is, well, I mean, it is, but it's this recurring, lingering thing that comes back. And even if you sort of tamp it down in one age and 1 year and one generation, it just sort of reforms, and it shape shifts and it morphs into something different. Many years ago, I referred to the legacy of racism and white supremacy somewhat cheekily, but I guess it was not altogether inaccurate, as historical herpes. It doesn't really go away. It stays with you and it flares up, only it's a lot more deadly and a lot more troublesome than that. And so we have to figure out as a society how we are going to respond to this 400-year-old pathogen, or however you want to characterize it, whether you want to put it in medical terms, psychological terms, or socially transmitted terms. Clearly, we haven't dealt with it. And when we think we have, that's when it changes form and moves in a different direction. And so we've gone through periods of overt white supremacy and somewhat less overt. We've gone through periods where the politics of America was about dog whistling, and now we're in an era where we've moved well beyond dog whistling into bullhorn racism and overt again, going back. The more things change, the more they stay the same. You do the 2 steps forward, you get 3 steps back. That's the history of how racism operates. And I think the mistake that we make is in thinking that there will be some type of minimization as time goes on, that the simple fact that the calendar pages turn and the hands on the clock move will somehow automatically ensure that we end up in a better place. And it's just not true. Every generation thinks that it's their parents who are the problem, or it's their grandparents who are the problem, and that they'll be the solution. But all of those folks right now, the boomers who we blame for it, When they were young, they thought they had the solution and it was their parents. And then when Generation X, which is what I am, we thought they were the problem and we'd fix it. And we didn't. So it's a constant struggle that we have to recommit ourselves to in every generation.
Very good. Charles.
Yeah, thank you so much. So as a scholar of racial terror lynching, something that I'm really have been interested in is looking at how what the history can inform our approaches to peace building and racial healing, if you will. And something that I'm seeing over and over again now, which we see constantly, we have oftentimes like-minded white allies who want to participate and be a part of this movement, and we see that throughout the Black freedom struggle as we look at other movements, specifically the anti-lynching campaign and other movements of the Black freedom struggle. But I'm interested in your thoughts on the ways in which, the practical ways that the white community can help and participate, because as an African American, it is very frustrating, as you can imagine, to constantly be asked by whites, what can we do, right? I think with your expertise, I think we would definitely get value from learning what your recommendations would be, because for African Americans, it's become very tiring to be asked these questions while we're processing and dealing with this trauma.
Sure. Well, I'll give two broad recommendations, and they're generic and general, but I think if people take them seriously, they will then figure out a way to come up with additional things in each of these categories. So the first thing, if you're going to really do the work as a white person in solidarity with folks of color and Black folks in particular, you have to, and this is going to sound easy, but if it were easy, we would have done it already. That is, you have to come to the radical conclusion and accept the radical conclusion. It's really not radical, or at least it ought not be, that Black people and folks of color more broadly know their reality better than you do. You have to be willing to accept that you have to listen more than talk, you have to read more than write, and you have to follow more than lead. And you have to be willing to listen to when Black and brown folks say this is what's going on, to not challenge their authority on that. It's not that Black and brown people are always right about everything, but it's their life they're talking about. So to say that I know more than you about your own life, that I know you think you're experiencing racism, but take it from me, you're not, isn't just arrogant, it's by definition racist, because it suggests that Black and brown peoples are not rational or intelligent enough to actually discern their own reality. So number one is relinquish your commitment to the idea of your own superior perception, right? And realize that people of color are in the position as the targets of oppression to know when it's happening better than those of us who are not. And once you've come to that conclusion, see, that leads to some other things, right? That allows you to join in organizational formations with Black and brown leadership and to follow their lead without being so defensive about the things they ask of you. It allows you to actually follow the lead of coworkers and colleagues who may be of color, who tell you what they need of you in that space without getting defensive. So number one is to learn to listen to the lived experience of people of color. The second piece, and it's connected to the first, is you have to excavate your own racialized history. See, a lot of times white liberals and white progressives, we will get to the point where we can see what racism does to Black bodies. We can see what racism did to George Floyd. We can watch what it did to Eric Garner. We can watch what it did to Tamir Rice on camera. We can watch what it did to John Crawford, but we don't necessarily excavate what race and the history of white supremacy has done in our bodies and with our lives. And so we say, well, we know racism is bad for these folks, but we don't deal with the flip side of that, which is that for every oppressive act, for every marginalization of a person of color, there was an elevation of white people. So unless we're willing to deal with the upside for us, because there can be no down without an up, there can be no discrimination without someone else being elevated. Unless we're willing to own that, it becomes very easy to sort of walk away from it over time. We might get animated in a moment. We may become enraged in these moments of breaking news and headline horribleness. But it becomes easy to then move on to the next thing or get distracted if all you're doing is doing it for other people and because it's their issue and you're just trying to help. We don't need white folks to get into this work because they're trying to help or to save Black and brown folk. Black and brown folk will ultimately liberate themselves. The question for white people is who's going to liberate us from white supremacy and what it's done to our mentality and what it's done to us physically and in our society. And see, if you haven't asked the question, what has white supremacy done to me?
Yeah.
and done to me as a person of European descent, then that question won't even make sense to you, let alone will you know how to answer it. And so you have to begin to excavate the side that's about privilege and obliviousness, the ability to not know the history of policing in this country and still be deemed competent. How is it that you can graduate from high school, graduate from college, become a cop, and not have to prove that you know the history of policing vis-a-vis Black people in this country? How is it possible that you can graduate high school, college, medical school, become a doctor, and not know the history of racism in the delivery of healthcare and medicine to Black and brown peoples, right? How is that possible? Well, it's possible because we don't ask white people to think about this as it relates to themselves. So we have to do that piece as well.
Brilliant. Andy, I mean, we want. I have so much to.
Well, go ahead. Why don't you do a follow up?
Yeah, I mean, especially as an educator, especially in higher ed, right? And someone who teaches and discusses race specifically from a historical perspective, I understand the utility of understanding race, right? But what does this look like specifically as it relates to someone in, the sciences or across? Because this is something really big what you're talking about in terms of higher education, right?
Sure.
How we're training professionals and practitioners who are masters of their field, like physicians,
Right.
doctors, as you mentioned, right? It's like, how can you have? I understand it, right?
Right.
But it's like, how can you get those in these fields to understand this and getting it integrated into curriculum, making it required, right? That's something that I think is on us as educators in higher ed, to figure out how this works.
Right.
Because it's so important, right?
Right. Well, I would love to be able to say that it's enough to stress the moral and ethical obligation of learning that material in order to be a more effective physician or a more effective therapist or a more effective kindergarten teacher or a more effective whatever it is. But I know that's not the case. I know that if Black and brown folks are waiting around for white folks to join the struggle based on morality and ethics, you'll be waiting a long time. We've seen 400 years of waiting. But I do believe that it is possible to get white folks, or at least some percentage greater than what we have now, to realize the interest that they have in understanding this better and internalizing it and integrating the knowledge into their practice. I mean, if I'm a physician, my goal theoretically is to do what? Is to produce healthy outcomes for the people I see. I mean, that's what I want to do. I don't want to just get healthy outcomes for the white patients, at least not theoretically. I don't want to just get healthy outcomes for certain people. I want anybody who I see in my practice to have a good outcome. Well, if I know that understanding the history of racism and healthcare delivery is part of that, that's going to be part of building trust between me and my Black patient, or me and my Latinx patient, or me and my Asian American patient, or me and my indigenous patient, meeting them where they are. If I'm a therapist, I'm trying to deal with the psychological and emotional well-being of folks, and I don't know the way that racism and white supremacy affect the psyche, the physical and emotional well-being of clients and patients of color, how in the hell do I serve them? So then what happens is, if I don't know that, I don't serve them as well. And now I am not as competent. So on a purely self-interested level, I ought to care about that. And I would suggest that when we think about the school system, there's been this big push in recent years for STEM field education, right? So science, tech, engineering, and math. And all of that's very important. God knows I'm glad somebody can do math and ain't me. I'm glad there are engineers. We need bridges that don't fall down. I'm glad that somebody's good with technology. I'm not. My camera could go out any second because I might hit a button. Okay, so we need some people who do all of those things. But we also need to remember that we could end up, if we just focus on STEM and we don't understand history and ethics and sociology, right? And we don't understand media literacy, right? If we don't understand those fields, I call them mesh: media literacy, ethics, sociology, and history. If we don't have mesh education, we could end up 20 years from now with all kinds of people that know how to code, right? And maybe we can do a better job of integrating folks of color into STEM fields and women of all colors, and we should do that. But we don't want to have a society of tech folks and engineers and coders who don't understand how to maintain functional multicultural pluralistic democracy, because there is no app for that, right? There's no app that's going to allow you to maintain pluralism and democracy against autocrats and authoritarians and fascists who are trying to take it from you. So we need to make sure that even the people doing science work as critical as that is, they need to understand the way that their discipline has been weaponized against certain communities, the way that technology has been weaponized. If I'm wanting to inspire young people to go into science, think about what's more inspiring. If I'm trying to get Black and brown kids to go into the science fields, as many are trying to do with STEM education efforts, right? What's going to be more inspiring? Telling them, oh, you can get a job that'll pay you better, or telling them, hey, you know what? If you don't learn this, and if you don't learn it better than white folks know it, they will use this against you and your community. So this is about self-defense. This is about liberation of the community you come from. So now it takes on social importance. It takes on political importance. It's a matter of life and death, not just a career, not just so you can get a certification and a diploma and a degree, right? It's actually about something even bigger than that. It takes on larger than life dimensions. And so I think we have to talk about the sciences, engineering, technology, and math in the same breath as media literacy, ethics, sociology, and history.
Most societies, when they have these types of conflicts, try to deal with them and try to go deeper inside and try to figure things out to be able to move forward. We have managed to sweep this stuff under the carpet for a long, long time, and we continue to be surprised when there are flare-ups, uprisings, protests, things like that that happen. And we always look at them as a one-off. You know, there's a bad cop or there's a bad person that did something wrong, without really looking at the systemic structure that created that cop, that created that structure, that made what happened happen. Yeah. So I want to bring it more to the present. This is, of course, the iPhone has changed the way we see racism. For whatever reason, people did not really understand racism in a very stark way until today. And I'm heartened by the fact that many of the demonstrators that are going out on the street are white people.
Yeah.
So I want to compare. I also lived in the United States. I was a young kid in the United States in 1968 when the '68 riots took off here in Washington, D.C. after the assassination of King. And can you talk to us a little bit about, and a lot of people are making a comparison between what's happening today and the death of George Floyd and what happened back then. Can you make some comparisons for us and put things in perspective? How far have we come? How far more do we have to go?
Well, you know, I think on the one hand, we can say there are a lot of similarities because in 1968, which was actually the year that I was born, I was 3 months in my mama's womb, as we say here in the South, when Dr. King was killed. And my mom carried me all throughout the period of all the uprisings of 1968. And so I came into the world at a time when activists in those days were, I think, convinced that the revolution was just around the corner. There was this great turning that was going to happen. And by the way, you know, there were also huge demonstrations and uprisings in Mexico City and in the Eastern Bloc during that time. All around the world, these things were happening. And what we know is, of course, that great turning wasn't as large as perhaps we expected it would be. And here in the United States, even though there was this presumption that something huge was getting ready to transform, in fact, we reverted to type. And so I think even though a lot is similar, a lot has changed. But like I said, there's regression and there's progression, and they can happen at the same time. And so what I think we have to do is we have to ask ourselves, what is it that keeps bringing us back, not to square one necessarily, because there's been progress made in various areas over a many hundred-of-year period, but what keeps bringing us back to these fundamental problems generation in and generation out? Why is it that, you know, when my father moved to Los Angeles in 1965, right before Watts, he and my mom were in Milwaukee right before the riots in '67. And then they were in Newark right before the riots there too. I'm starting to think maybe my parents had something to do with this shit, and I'm not totally sure, but they seem to be wherever those things were happening. And then I come into the world in '68. These things keep happening, and here we are a half century later having some of the same conversations. I think the reason for that is what we have to get at. And the reason that, going back to the first thing you said in your question, which is how we deal with this maybe differently or not at all compared to other countries, is that this country, uniquely among countries on the planet, was founded on a principle of rugged individualism and meritocracy, right? In Europe, the countries whence now called white people came, that wasn't the gig there, right? Like nobody believed that England was a meritocracy, or that France was a meritocracy, or that Ireland was a meritocracy, or Italy, or anywhere. Like we understood these were feudal systems. And if you were living in a feudal system and you were a peasant, your only chance was revolution. You knew that. You weren't going to be able to double down on your work effort and suddenly get a better deal. But in this country, we created an ideology that said, what? Wherever you end up is all about you. So if you made it, it's because you're really great. And if you didn't, it's your own fault. You should have worked harder. Now, I want us to think about what happens when that's the operative social gospel in your country. And it is, right? It's Genesis 1:1 in the Bible of Americanism, is this idea that you get out what you put in, and, you know, it's all basically up to you. If you believe that and you make the teaching of that principle the foremost element of your social dynamic and your social gospel, you can't be surprised when hundreds of years later, you have people looking around and they see what? They see white folks disproportionately here, not exclusively, but disproportionately. They see black and brown folks disproportionately here. They see rich folks here. They see poor folks of all color here. They see men here. They see women disproportionately here. And they start to come to conclusions that say, I guess the men and the white folks and the rich folks are just better, and they work harder, and they have better values, maybe even better DNA. And the people of color and the poor folks and the women, they just don't want it as hard. Their values aren't as good. Their culture is defective. Maybe they're biologically inferior. See, so suddenly racism, sexism, and classism all start to be logical because you told a lie from the get-go that said that wherever you end up is all about you. Now, the way that plays into policing is, if I am poor and on the block and struggling to make ends meet, and I'm engaged in maybe some petty criminality, or maybe somebody thinks I am, so they say I'm passing a $20 counterfeit bill, maybe I'm not even doing that. And even if I am, the law says you can get a citation for that. You don't have to be arrested for that. You can be cited for that and have to come to court later. So even if that were true, it wouldn't justify what happened to George Floyd. But if you're doing anything like that, if you're slinging weed on the corner, right, as opposed to slinging it in a corporate suite and doing coke off the, you know, off the bar or whatever you're doing, right? The assumption is you're in that position at the bottom, slinging weed on the corner or whatever it is you're doing, because there's something wrong with you. Because if you didn't have something wrong with you, you'd be the corporate executive. If you didn't have something wrong with you, you'd have a quote unquote real job, right? Which I guess means pushing opioids under the rubric of a pharmaceutical company would make you a legitimate drug dealer. Or having a weed shop in Colorado, you know, would be legitimate, and you got a storefront because daddy gave you the money for startup, or what, I don't know. But like, the point being, the meritocracy idea justifies police violence, because police see people that are on the bottom engage in some really minor ticky-tack stuff, which is what stop and frisk in New York was, right? Almost all the stops and frisks were for some minor stuff, like supposedly trespassing or loitering or furtive movements, which is whatever the cops want to say that it is, or simply being in a high crime neighborhood, which means by definition, using that as the rationale, they could just stop any black person any day in New York. And they did, and they hardly ever found guns, and they hardly ever found drugs, because they weren't stopping people based on actual suspicious behavior. They were stopping people based on demographic characteristics and categories. And so that happens, however, because if I'm a cop in New York and I've been told all my life, these neighborhoods are like this because the people are flawed, and because the culture's flawed, and their mama's flawed, and their auntie's flawed, and they might even be biologically defective, because I read the bell curve and it told me that, right? Then all of a sudden you can't be surprised when they figure that they don't have to treat these folks like human beings. So I think that's what keeps us grounded in this problem and keeps bringing us back to the same stuff that we were dealing with in 1968 and 1938 and 1858.
So the way forward, is it better training? Is it more connections with people? What is the way forward? How do you see that playing?
Well, I think we have to do something along the line. This is just I say it's easy. It's not, or we would have done it. We've got to do something that would get at the truth and bring some accountability. You know, South Africa, after apartheid fell, did a truth and reconciliation process. Rwanda has done the same. They've done similar things in Northern Ireland. And I'm not saying that that's the end all be all, and it hasn't solved all the problems in those places I just mentioned. And I don't even like the term reconciliation, because to me, it's very hard to reconcile something that was never conciled in the first place. But Truth and Justice Commission, where we actually have to confront the past and how the past has affected the present. We have to do that. If we do not do that, that won't solve the problem, but it's necessary to solve the problem. I think a second thing we have to do, particularly regarding policing, there can be no more of this talk of how we're going to train police out of the way that they are currently treating Black and brown communities. You can't just do implicit bias training. This is not implicit, right? Subconscious implicit bias. I know that it's a thing. I've seen the research. I've written about it. I've talked about it. That is not what causes a man to put a knee on a man's neck for 8.5 minutes. Implicit bias might explain why those cops in New York City thought that Amadou Diallo had a gun instead of the wallet that he actually had, but it can't explain 41 shots. It can maybe explain the initial fear reaction. It can maybe even explain a couple of shots that get fired because you're on a hair trigger, but 41 shots later, at some point, right, you move, that bias went from the basement to the attic. It's not subconscious anymore. It's at the top. Same thing with, Derek Chauvin. At some point, like you may say when he pulls George Floyd to the ground and initially holds him down, that it's implicit bias, that he reacted more harshly than he would have had this person been white. But 2 minutes later, 3 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 8 minutes later, you got people around you saying stop. You got people around you saying for 2.5 minutes of that, he's not moving. He's not responsive. At some point, it's not fear and it's not implicit. It's contempt and it's explicit. You can't train out of that. You have to actually alter the structures, because the thing about training starts with the proposition that the system is basically legitimate, and you just got to fix these individuals in the system. That the system's somehow failing, and if we just train people, it won't fail. The system's not failing. The system is doing what the system was intended to do. Policing was never meant to actually be democratic, pluralistic, or legitimate. It was meant to be about domination and control, about instilling fear in certain populations that you wanted to subjugate. That's the history. So we have to move to different forms of public safety. We have to put the power to bring public safety into the community and the people who live there. Now, in the short run, before we get to depolicing and defunding, which is what I think we need to be talking about, that's obviously a transitional process. We're not going to do that overnight. But I'll tell you what we could do, and we could begin this right now. What about saying this, that if you want to be a police officer in any community of color, you have to be ratified by the people in that community before you get the gun and before you get the power of arrest. So for the first 6 months, you're on the payroll, but you don't have a gun and you don't have the power of arrest. You are to go into the community and you're to talk to people on their porches, at their doorstep, in the barbershop, in the bodega, on the block, in the house of worship, and you're to get to know them for 6 months. Basically, for 6 months, you're a community organizer, because the first thing an organizer does is learn to listen. So for 6 months, you go and you listen to people and you ask them questions about what they need from you. And at the end of 6 months, when you've gotten to actually know them and they've gotten to know you, they get to vote on you. The community gets to vote. The chief doesn't control it. The Fraternal Order of Police, the union, they don't control it, right? The community will vote on you, yes or no. And here's the thing. If you're the kind of brutal cop that doesn't want to submit to that, you're going to select out of policing. Good. Then that's one less person we got to deal with down the road. Now, that's only a stopgap measure. I would rather that we turn that public safety function over to people in the community itself. But in the meantime, let's at least democratize the process. Let's talk about some self-determination for people in that space, letting them decide who's going to police their streets. And we could do the same thing for teachers, by the way, and I think we should.
Getting a lot of thumbs up on that one.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, great idea. Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, just to answer your question as well, Andy, I think for me, I would be remiss if I wouldn't point to the work of Gail Christopher, and something that she really pushes in her work is this narrative change. Brian Stevenson references it as well, but that is so important across the spectrum. I mean, social, narrative change through museums, education, higher ed, across the board, policing, training, etc. I mean, the story, it's built on this fallacy, as Tim has mentioned, right? Even this whole idea of lynching and what we're witnessing, I find myself, upset whenever I have to code it by saying, oh, it's modern day lynching. No, this was a lynching that took place in terms of what happened to George Floyd. It is what it is. This was a message crime, no different from what we saw and we've seen throughout the history of this country, where those who are often deemed to protect and serve are right amongst the crowd, if not participating, under the cover of their privilege. And that is something for people to understand and for students and educators to connect, right? So this is a part of a larger pattern, right? This is not something that, this moment that we're living in to be outraged about, yes, But we have to understand that black and brown communities have been living with this terror that you're just now being exposed to. And to live with that, as Tim mentioned, it's so much different. And when you understand it that way, your response and the strategies that you come up with and the ways in which you try to support said communities is different because you're listening first and you understand the legacy of that trauma. But I think we should transition now to maybe some questions from the public. Do we have any, I guess some of the moderators, some of the people who are fielding the questions, do we have any questions from Twitter? Or I don't want to steal all of the show. I wanted to allow some people to come in.
Well, maybe while we're collecting the questions and we can have them brought to us, I just want to ask Tim about maybe making some comments about the current political climate and its impact on how race is perceived and how we are moving forward or not in this period. I know for a lot of folks, this current president has been stoking, of course, a lot of the racism, the hatred, the divisions, and all of that. Sometimes you need to stir it up before you can actually make it happen. Is what he's doing moving this dialogue, this much needed effort forward, or is it really making a step back?
Well, I mean, everything he does makes things worse, but out of his actions, we have the capacity to, going back to the point that Charles was making about the narrative change, the narrative shift, we have the opportunity to shift the narrative and take that from him. He is going to try, I have no doubt, and he already is, right, to use this notion of law and order the way that Nixon did in 1968 to talk about quote unquote thugs and talk about Antifa being behind all this and as a way to besmirch Black Lives Matter and all of these things. A couple things worth noting though, and this goes back to your question about 1968. I don't think that's going to work for him the way that it worked for Nixon. And the reason is Nixon wasn't in power at the time. He used that theme in 1968 to gain power. Johnson was in power. The world was falling apart. And it was easy for Nixon and his forces to say, God, you see what's happening in Chicago? They can't even control their own side. Don't you want someone new to come in? But this is all happening on Trump's watch. And he can try to blame it on Democratic governors. But I think the reality is he has bungled everything from coronavirus to other things at this point to such an extent that there are people now, people who aren't even leftist by any stretch of the imagination, people that are not on the left, people that are not that progressive, who nonetheless are not going to look at him as the avatar for who's going to bring peace and justice to the society, right? Like even if you are worried about law and order and criminality and quote unquote looting and property destruction, is Donald Trump the guy that's hiding in the bunker, which hadn't been used since they put Dick Cheney in there on 9/11? Like that's your guy that's going to keep you and America safe? Are you kidding? He's like the rich kid on the playground that used to pay other people to beat people up, right? Because he didn't want to get his hands dirty. So it's like, I'll give you $10. Can you go and be tough for me? Like what? So I don't think that's going to work for him. But what I think is going to happen, and I certainly hope is going to happen, and I think is that precisely because this is all happening, boom, 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 one after the other, coronavirus and then this, that has actually given us an opportunity to shift the narrative. Because here for the very first time, we have millions of white people. I'm not talking about the protesters and the open it back up people and the cue ball folks and the anti-vaxxers and all them. Forget them. I'm talking about the folks who the polls say, even among most whites and even among most Republicans, are concerned about the health crisis of COVID-19, and they're worried about opening things back up too fast. Even if they want to, they're still nervous, they're still scared. Now think about this. This is an opportunity for the first time for millions of white people, I'm talking middle class and above, particularly middle class and above white men, to actually wonder, is it safe to do something, to go to the store, to go shopping, to walk around the neighborhood, to go to the park, to go to a ball game? Is it safe? Well, these are the kind of questions that Black and brown folks have been asking long before there was a pandemic threat. They ask it every day. Is it safe to go to the store? Well, it wasn't for John Crawford. Is it safe to go to the park? Well, it wasn't for Tamir Rice. Right? Is it safe to go for a jog around the neighborhood? Well, it wasn't for Ahmaud Arbery. So for white folks, we're now starting to ask the question, even questions like, am I going to have a job in 3 months? How am I going to pay my bills? Am I going to have health care in case I get sick? Will I be able to afford it? These are questions poor people of all races ask. These are questions that folks of color. So this is an opportunity for empathy. This is an opportunity for us to say, hey, you remember that time that that black person told you about some shit that happened to them and you didn't get it and you didn't understand why they were afraid and why they were trying to figure out, you know, telling their kid about keep their hands at 10 and 2 if the cop stops you, and what are you going to wear when you go for the walk, and what are you going to wear when you go to the mall, and you didn't understand what the fear was because you never had to think about it. Well, now there are things white folks are having to think about. Older white folks, senior white folks who tend to be often very conservative, what are they looking at? They're looking at some of their white comrades, so to speak, who are willing to kill grandma just to get the economy back open so they can get back to Hooters and buy bottomless wings. They can get back to Olive Garden and get bottomless breadsticks and salad. And they're like, well, we know some folks are going to die, but you know, you're already 83 and everybody goes sometime. Like if I'm an old white person, I'm like, for real? Like you're just willing, I'm disposable too? Because see, I thought only the brown folks were disposable. But basically what these other white folks are saying is, no, we meant you too. Oh, and you have a pre-existing condition. Your kid is immunosuppressed. Oh, you're recovering from cancer. Oh, you have diabetes. Well, that's a shame for that whole pre-existing condition thing. See, there are millions of white folks who have pre-existing conditions, and children have pre-existing conditions. And some of these open it up folks, they're ready to roll the dice on their life. That's an opportunity for coalition building. That's an opportunity for empathy. That's an opportunity to say, do you see what happens when you allow a mentality of human disposability and a hierarchy of value to take root in your society? You may have thought it was only going to be those people on that side of town that were going to be affected. But when they get done with them, they're coming for you. Now, do you get it? That is the opportunity that we've been given if we're prepared to take it.
But of course, I mean, to just take it one step further, and then we'll take some of the questions, is that's race has always been that additional card that you throw in, no matter what your condition is, no matter what happened to you, no matter where you are, no matter what, race will always play up. And to watch for a lot of the white folks who are, you know, going to go out and vote, to watch black people, breaking things and being angry and being in the street and yelling in the face of cops is a pretty scary thing, and may, the narrative may not be so easily changed.
Well, the good news is most of the video we have of people actually breaking things are white kids. And they're not Antifa white kids either. They're white kids with skateboards whose parents threw them out of the house, I don't know, for playing video games too much. And they were decided, I'm going to go break the AutoZone glass. Like this is not Antifa. These are not organized anti-racist people. These are just jackasses, or they're right-wing provocateurs, because we know the Boogaloo Boy guys and all these white nationalists have been announcing on 4chan and Reddit and Discord servers for video gamers that they're going to go disrupt. So that's who's doing this stuff. There's police in Colorado that just busted a couple of these Boogaloo guys who were right-wing anti-government folks by and large, had a whole cache of weapons in their car. That's not Antifa doing that. That's a bunch of right-wingers doing that. So yes, Trump and his minions are going to try to spin it as Antifa and then connect that to the left and then connect that to BLM. But the good news is we've got video of black activists begging these white kids to stop breaking stuff. Begging. There's a video of a young black woman in Minneapolis that's on the bullhorn saying, please stop. And these white folks are like, oh, I'm breaking windows because woo, anarchy or whatever. And that's where their heads are at. But black folks are telling them, y'all need to check it because we're the ones who are going to get blamed. They're going to come after us. We're the ones they're going to kill. We're the ones they're going to lock up. So we've got video evidence that the people that are running this thing are trying to be nonviolent and exercising restraint that, given 400 years of oppression, is unbelievable. Unbelievable for us to lecture, white folks to lecture black people about violence when we come from, our ancestors lost their shit over some taxes on tea, and we're gonna sit and lecture other people about their tendencies to be extreme. Please, we've got the evidence of who's doing this, and it's not black and brown people, and we've just gotta be clear about that narrative.
Audrey, it looks like she's ready with some questions.
All right.
Yep. I'm going to just do kind of just go and add in a few questions. I'm kind of synthesizing from what we've got from people because we've got a lot of really interesting subjects to discuss. So I'm just going to add in, I've seen a question a lot about what specifically can businesses and organizations do to be part of this. We've talked a lot about kind of personal, but also what is the role of institutions? What are some specific pieces of advice to give. I've seen a lot of questions as well about what are some other resources in terms of reading, like Tim, what have you been reading? You know, what has really helped you? You know, what can you share there? I'm going to leave it at that because there are a few more, but I think those two kind of have a similar feel.
Well, the reading piece, I mean, just in terms of, you can see I got a bunch of books behind me. I'm not going to claim I read all these books, but I've had a lot of them for a long time. I've read many of them at least. But most recently, I would say the two books that I think have been most helpful in, for me, getting a clarity around things I knew. It wasn't like it was completely revelatory, but really put things in perspective, would be Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning. How to Be an Anti-Racist is also a fantastic book, but Stamped from the Beginning makes so clear where these ideas come from that shape our society, that are at the root of our society. So that one for sure. And then Carol Anderson's book, White Rage. You know, she's a professor at Emory in Atlanta, and White Rage is a very short book, 185 pages, maybe 200 pages, not even that. But what she does is she explains so much about the moment that we're in right now by talking about how every step forward for Black folks in American history has been met with this countervailing reaction of backlash or white rage. And we're in that cycle right now, with Trumpism being the reaction to Obama, right? Putting aside the concrete gains that Obama did or did not bring about for Black folks, symbolically, it was a step forward at the very least. And in reaction, we get the guy that says Obama's not even American. We get the guy who represents the detritus of the Tea Party movement. So I would say those two books have been just unbelievably helpful. Obviously, anything James Baldwin ever put on paper is worth reading. As far as the first part of the question, I think businesses, whether small or large, you know, think about, I know there are corporate giving campaigns, there are businesses that, you know, contribute to organizations, and they sometimes put the power of their institution behind that giving effort. I think it's important that we start to ask those businesses that say they're about something in this moment to put their money where their mouths happen to be, or at least where they seem to be in a given moment. That means directing some of those funds to people of color-led organizations, directing those funds to the larger movement for Black lives, directing those funds to people that are pushing for police accountability, directing some of those funds to white anti-racist organizations that work in solidarity directly with Black-led groups like SURJ, Showing Up for Racial Justice, SURJ, of which there are well over 100 chapters. I don't even know the number now, but well over 100 around the country. Folks can follow their local activities on local Facebook pages of SURJ, find out what actions are taking place, find out how they can get involved and deepen their commitment. And so I think businesses can do all of those things and more. It's also very important that businesses and employers, just in general, really evaluate their policies, practices, and procedures to make sure that they're doing everything that they can to ensure equity in hiring, equity in promotion, equity in the evaluation of work product. Everybody wants to believe that they do those things fairly. Everybody wants to believe that they are unbiased in the way that they do outreach and recruitment and hiring, but we know from the evidence that that's not true. A lot of people intend well, but they don't realize that it's not just the implicit bias piece, which is part of it. It's also that sometimes the procedures we're using are inherently biased. You know, if I'm an employer, for instance, and I'm looking at resumes and job applicants, and I'm saying, well, this person's got 7 years and this person's only got 4 years of experience. Well, I might assume the set person with 7 years of experience is more qualified, but it could also be that they're just somebody that got in the pipeline first because they had the right connections, because they had the opportunities that somebody else didn't have. So I've got to reevaluate all of the criteria that I'm using to make these decisions, because sometimes they reinforce inequity without me meaning to do that.
And also, I think I want to add, your books, of course, are quite important as well. White Like Me is one of those major books that I think a lot of people should read. Dear White America, you have what was Under the Influence, I think was
The Affluence. Yeah.
I mean, you've written a lot of books on this subject, and I think your books are really beautifully analytical. And I think the thing that I like about they're almost like they give you a roadmap. You know, almost like it's not just like you're not just writing stuff just to write it, but it really does give some ways forward, some solutions, some ideas on how to move the dialogue beyond just, you know, rhetoric.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
And also to mention his newest book, as well. Tim, I think it would be a great opportunity to kind of like tee that up for us and let us know
Sure.
that your most recent work.
Well, so it's set to come out in December. It's called Dispatches from the Race War, which is a series of essays that actually cover a 12-year period. Starts the night of the Obama election, covers the years of the Obama election into the Trump years, and then various themes that sort of transcend both of those administrations. And these are pre-published, these are essays that have appeared somewhere before in print or online with slight editing and improvements, and there are a few possibly new ones in there. So Dispatches from the Race War, which will be out. And the idea behind this, actually came to me many years ago, and it's in the intro to the book. Many years ago, I was 25, 26 years old. I was at a family reunion in Memphis, and I had an aunt who I'd already been doing this work for a few years, and she knew that. And it was like a great aunt, elderly woman. And she said to me over breakfast one morning at the Embassy Suites in Germantown, which is the sort of affluent part of the Memphis area. She said, Tim, and she always would pronounce my name with this heavy Southern accent that made it sound like it had 3 syllables. She would say, "Do you think we're ever going to have a race war?" And I said, I didn't want to have the conversation. I was 25, 26. The last thing I want to do is talk to an old Southern white lady who I love dearly, but I didn't want to talk to her about if there was going to be a race war, but she wanted to know, and I decided I'll give her the answer. And I said, I think the problem with the question is it assumes we're not already in one. And I would say that we've been in one for, at that point, 375 years and now 400 years. And we started it. But we only decided that it was a race war when they, meaning black and brown folks, decided to fight back and started winning a few of the battles. And then all of a sudden it became a problem. And so I call this book Dispatches from the Race War because not only has that been the arc of American history, the last 12 years have been all about that. And the only downside of this is when you're writing a book on race and you've sent it to your editor and it's supposedly done, in the back of your mind, some shit's about to jump off that is going to make you have to go back and add things. So now probably 15 of the essays that were going to be in the book are going to have to come out of the book and be replaced by things that I've written in the last week or will write in the next 2 weeks, because I want to make it as up to date and, current as possible. But as we all know, when you write about these things, this is the background noise of everything that happens in this country. Which is why when white folks say, why do you have to make everything about race? Because everything is about race.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that, of course, Tim, is that the writing about race is as relevant today as it was sometimes when it was written. I read James Baldwin, and it feels like it is current as could possibly be.
Absolutely.
And, so maybe you should leave those essays in there.
Yeah, maybe I will. We'll just make it a 500-page book.
Exactly.
The publisher will not be happy with that, but we'll see. Yeah, we'll see.
All right, let's see, Audrey. We have a few more or one more.
Yeah, we are also fast approaching the end, so I want to make sure we can be respectful of time. But we're going to invite one of our Mason students in to ask his question, Alan. But before I do that, I just want to take a quick moment to say that there have also been questions about reparations. Yes. What about reparations, basically, is the question. And also, what about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Could we do that? What would need to happen? But now I'm going to go over to Alan so he can ask his question.
Okay.
Great, thank you, and thank you, Tim, and the organizers for the opportunity today. So, people say you're either on the right side of the fence or you're not. You can be in between, and I get the what of that critique. I didn't start on the right side of the fence per se. I did an internship program that got Ann Coulter's career started, but now I'm working for the advocacy office of the Episcopal Church. But what I struggle with is how of that? How do you help others to get across that fence without straddling the fence in a way that it prolongs injustice? And particularly for people with privilege, what advice do you have for improving the process of helping to get people from the wrong side of the fence to the right side of the fence?
I think the best way to do that, and I appreciate that question, and I appreciate your own journey in this, is you have to, if I'm going to approach somebody who's not quite there yet, whether they're straddling the fence or maybe they're on the wrong side, but they're good people and I know they're decent people and they're not, they're not horrible people. They're just not there. I have to approach them the way that I would have wanted to have been approached before I got it, quote unquote, right? Because we all have a moment, no matter how far along we think we are today, there's a moment before we knew what we know now, right? Or before we were there. And so what was that like? What did we need to hear to get us over the fence or off the fence? And once we start thinking about that, then all kinds of approaches can come up, and questions and ways of approaching that person the way that we know we needed to be approached, and maybe the way that we were. What did it take for us? Probably the same thing is going to be needed for them, is what I would say. As far as the sort of melange of other things that you mentioned that people were sort of throwing out there, the reparations and the Truth and Reconciliation, because I know we're running out of time. Truth and Reconciliation, I think we want to do local equivalents of that whenever possible. There have been some attempts in places like Detroit and elsewhere, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because of the Greenwood Massacre in 1921, right? This idea that we can start to have these conversations locally about what happened. We need a national effort, but let's do local efforts, because all of us are living on stolen land. All of us are living on land of profound injustice. Let's have a conversation about that right where we live. That's not that hard to find people who've lived through some of those things, and the materials are there and we can find them. As far as reparations, I have been on the record supporting systemic reparations for, 20 years approximately. And I think how we get there is something we're going to have to debate and discuss, and what it looks like. But I think that the idea of systemic repair, not just cutting individual checks to individual people, because that's not a systemic reparation. That's just buying off people's pain. And we've got to do more than that. It's about making sure that the wealth that was robbed from entire communities, not just from individuals living in isolation, because we don't live in isolation, but the wealth that was robbed from entire communities is restored. And it's the kind of thing we did for our enemies after World War II. We spent billions of dollars to help rebuild people that we had bombed. During the war. We spent billions of dollars to get housing opportunity for white folks in this country when they came back from the war, with VA loans and FHA loans that were mostly off limits to Black and brown folks. So we have a precedent for this level of investment. And it was for people that we didn't owe reparations to at all. We didn't owe reparations to those individuals in other countries, but we paid significant amounts of sums because of the social benefit of doing so. The same is true now. There's a moral case, an ethical case, and a practical case. You put billions or even trillions of dollars back into communities from which it was looted. They're going to spend that money. That's going to stimulate the economy. That's going to benefit everyone, not just the people that were making whole with reparations.
And reparations can also take on a more localized effort as well.
Absolutely.
They don't have to be on a national scale, as sometimes can be. I know that Sheila Jackson Lee has been working on this issue for a long, long time. Yep. And we actually have put an effort here forward in Washington, D.C. to try to get reparations for D.C. itself. There are areas and neighborhoods that have been blighted for years, all because of the legacies that you spoke about. Absolutely. So I think those types of efforts are starting to get some traction. Charles.
Yeah, how much were we on? Okay, we have 1 minute, right?
Yeah, 1 minute.
What can I ask in 1 minute? No, I want to thank Tim for joining us, and you and Andy and everyone else who allowed us to bring this together. I think we've brought some hope in spite of this situation, but the conversation continues, not only next week, but also online. And from what I understand, we're going to continue the conversation on our Facebook page. You can find us at John Mitchell Jr. or JMJP_GMU on Facebook, where we're continuing the conversation. But also next week, we're proud to announce that we'll have Eddie Glaude joining us from Princeton University and MSNBC, who will continue this conversation as we all work through and live through this moment in history. Audrey, is there anything else you'd like to say as we close out, or in terms of directions, or we good to go?
I will just say that as you've probably been able to see at the top of your screen, this has been live streamed on Facebook. We've also been recording it. So when we do a follow-up, we'll definitely be sending more information to everyone about how they can access the recording. We'll definitely be sending more information about how you can keep in touch with all of our programs, Busboys and Poets, the JMJP, Marilyn Lynching Memorial Project, because we really want this to kind of be the start of a broader discussion. We know that, the great thing about this medium is that we get to reach a lot of people. the difficult thing is we don't get to have those really intimate conversations maybe the way that we would want to, but we are looking into ways to really expand that, whether it's more events like this, as will be happening throughout June, but also expanding that conversation on Facebook. So is there anyone else who wanted to say any parting words? I want to just say thank you to everyone for joining. Thank you, Andy and Dr. Chavis, for your moderation. And thank you, of course, Tim, for just this fantastic discussion.
Thank you. Thank all of you so much.
Really appreciate your time. I know you're very busy and high in demand, so we really appreciate you being here
Please,
for our
thank
launch
you.
of this series, and look forward. And I think a lot of the topics that have come up, there'll be topics we'll be talking about in the next few weeks. So if you're talking about reparations, we're going to have a whole program on reparations alone. But thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Chavis, and everybody else. Until next week, we'll see you then.